Hello and welcome back to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we're going to talk about what to expect from MMA promotions in the current new year of 2023. John, how the hell are you?
Besides the fact that I'm still signing everything 2022, okay, doing all right.
I have only had to sign a couple of things. I went to the doctor twice, and I went today back to my very first PT of the year, and I haven't had the problem. I don't know. I've been geared for 2023 since about November.
I figured about March I'll have it figured out.
Well, I guess we should get right into this, and you know, we're here in 2023, and a whole heck of a lot of things are happening in MMA right now. I mean, it's been a busy week.
Yeah, it's the last couple of weeks. We've got a year's worth of news stories in the last couple of weeks.
We really do. And besides the UFC, there's all these other promoters that seem to actually be trying to cement themselves as major players. Now, what should we expect for this year, and what are some of the more important possibilities that we should sort of be keeping our eyes open for?
Well, I guess that's what the episode's for. We have PFL, we have Bellator, we have Ryzen, one championship, the UFC, the entire industry. We have a lot going on with all of them. So have at it.
All right. Well, you know what? Let's start with the PFL because they have the biggest news as far as their roster right now, in that they signed Jake Paul. So I guess we should start there.
I'm all ears. Let's start with PFL. Sounds perfect.
All right. So they kind of like to boast about being the number 2 promotion. But how are they doing financially? Because I saw a comment from Kelsey. She said, how are they doing it? It doesn't seem like the math is actually mathing with the PFL. And that made a lot of sense to me because I often wonder, too, how the hell do they make money?
Well, right now they're losing money. They're losing a lot of money per year because they're trying to build a product. And they collect some money. They don't sell. We know, and Paul Gibbs actually kept track of this great for years now. They don't sell a lot in tickets. So there's not a lot of demand on their ticket front. Their TV deal, they do have an ESPN deal now, but it's not a gangbuster deal. It is much better. They signed a new deal this year. Before, they were getting like $3 million a year. Started last year for the ESPN deal. So that's like $300,000. And I think they did 10 shows, so $300,000 a show. Now it's probably around $10 million. So it's a lot bigger, but that still doesn't cover the $10 million payouts at the end for all the champs, right? So every year they're losing money, but they've raised a lot of money. And, you know, that's the point of raising the money, is to spend that money to build up the brand, to build up cards, to acquire fighters so they can start selling it for more money and then eventually make a profit. And so that's the plan. And that's where the Jake Paul comes in, because they signed Jake Paul as part of the MMA. He's now assigned to the PFL. And with him, he's in charge of the super fight division. As they call it, which is their pay-per-view division. And so they've been planning to do this for years now. They've talked about, they held their first pay-per-view last year, which did not do well. It sold very badly. But I think a lot of people, they overestimate. It did badly, but think, they put on a pay-per-view, but they didn't put on a pay-per-view with massive stars that had big guarantees, right? We view Kayla Harrison as a big star, because she probably got like $1 million for it. But in the grand scheme of combat sports, that's not a huge purse, right? So even though they lost tons of money on that pay-per-view, what that did is they got to hold their first pay-per-view, kind of work out the kinks in the system, test it out, and they have ESPN as a partner. And the good thing about that is ESPN also sells UFC pay-per-views. And so ESPN, through ESPN Plus, has all the data on who buys pay-per-views. They collect who buys it. They can see, you know, what advertising gets people to buy it. They can see what fighters. And so they now can directly, like ESPN does, you know, I'm sure you get the email you look at your email before a UFC event and it tells you what fight's coming up and you better get your pay-per-view. I know I get that. They can directly target fans, and they can use special promotions for the fans they think that they can get to buy PFL pay-per-views with the right fighters on it.
They say they're the clear number 2, are they?
That is very, very, very misleading right now. I should say they are. I think they're doing good. We'll talk about some of the other promotions who make the same claim later, who I think even have less of a claim to it. But the Don Davis likes to really boast about their roster, and I think he grossly exaggerates the roster. They talk about we have 25% of the top 25 on Fight Matrix. Then you look at Fight Matrix, they have nowhere close to that number. Truthfully, Bellator has the largest number of top 25 fighters easily outside the UFC.
Okay, so, we're going to go to Bellator in just a second, but I got to...
We will, yes, but back to PFL. So they're not even close to that. What PFL has, and also they don't have the metrics one does, but again, we have questions about one's metrics. But they do have ESPN. They work with ESPN, so they have a platform that probably has a bigger reach to the MMA fan base in America than any other besides UFC. And they do have raised a lot of money. They burned through a bunch, but they have raised a lot of money, kind of like one. But they're sitting on this money, and with that money, they are doing something. Which I want to compliment on this. They're doing something that one didn't do, but I think this is smart by PFL. Their objective is they've made it clear they want to sign big name fighters to put on pay-per-views. And they made a whole big deal about how they're going to offer 50% of the pay-per-view revenue. Now, that offer really means nothing, because if you're going to offer big name fighters like, Nate Diaz or Conor McGregor or Francis Ngannou to come over to PFL, the idea that you're going to give them just 50% of the pay-per-view revenue doesn't mean much. You got to give them a guarantee like they do in boxing. Canelo Alvarez doesn't show up for just 50% of the pay-per-view. He shows up for a guarantee of tens of millions. And on top of that, when they cross the line, he gets more than 50% of him and his opponent. Him and Golovkin got more than 50% of the DAZN pay-per-view if it went beyond a certain point. So they're probably going to have to do something like that for the biggest name fighters. But I do like the idea that, I hope they do that. I hope they're aware that they're going to have to do that, because otherwise I don't think this will work if they start telling fighters that all you're going to get is the 50%. But I do like the idea they're trying the MMA business. The brands, they're still building their brands, but brands really mean nothing. It's all about the stars. And the stars, even though UFC makes a ton of their ESPN deal, the truth is it's the pay-per-view, the big fights that draw all the revenue. And so they're making a smart decision, I think, to focus on trying to get the biggest name fighters possible and give them a big cut of the split to get them in the promotion.
Now, I read that only that division, the super fight division, will be splitting the profit, splitting the revenue. That's what I read, and that there are other pay-per-views. That there are other pay-per-views. We're not going to follow that same model.
No. You've seen the PFL investors presentation, and we'll talk about it at a future date. But if you look at that, it talks about how much the wages they have set aside, they have projecting for fighters, and it's not near 50%. It's a very small percentage, kind of a UFC percentage that's going to go to fighters on the regular media package. For the only 50% split is on the pay-per-view event revenue. So, on that front, that's, I think total revenue that they're projecting, not counting the pay-per-view split, $220 million in a couple of years from now. I'm going off the top of my head. And about 20% of that is earmarked for the fighters, right? So that's a UFC split. It's the pay-per-view fighters. They're the ones that they're talking about offering this split to. But so the other fighters, it's not like this isn't groundbreaking for the other fighters. Although their purse system does help a lot of other fighters. It's higher than they normally get, that bonus win. But it would be a massive change for fighters for the biggest stars. If the biggest stars can start going other places to make more money, guess what happens? They're challengers. They're opponents that they need to sell with, because often a fight itself doesn't make a fight, doesn't sell a ton of pay-per-views. It's the specific opponent. They can start asking for more. And then it starts trickling down, because the next thing is the high-ranked guys that can create a pay-per-view opponent or a future star. They can start asking for more.
Can the PFL be successful, especially with a weak pay-per-view division?
Well, that's the question. They have this. I think it's possible. It matters how much resources they really have and how many fighters are truly available. And we'll get into the availability of fighters when we get to the UFC, but that's the big question. The thing is, Jake Paul, them signing bait Jake Paul, I think was smart, even though I think it's not. My understanding, he signed to the PFL for exclusively the MMA fights, right? Mm-hmm. He's still not under an exclusive deal with PFL for boxing. That's my understanding. Could be wrong, but asking around, that's what it seems to be. But PFL is very confident. I think they almost guaranteed it that he will have an MMA fight this year in 2023. That's what I was told. And so that would be huge for them to have him in an MMA fight. If they get him against Nate Diaz or something, that could be a gigantic pay-per-view, especially with ESPN promoting it. Mm-hmm. So that's huge for them. And it's big for the fact that he brought a ton of attention. So hopefully that attention spills over to their product as a whole. If they can get people buying their pay-per-view, they might decide, well, I'm buying the pay-per-view and some of the fighters coming from their tournaments are appearing on these pay-per-views. I'll start watching the rest of the PFL product. But the pay-per-view, even if they buy the pay-per-view, that can generate enough money that they can make more on the pay-per-view than they do on their regular ESPN content.
Let's talk about Bellator and Ryzen, because when you sent me the outline, you put these two together. Why?
Well, because really they're kind of operating together right now. They're almost dependent on each other. Ryzen is actually surprisingly successful. I don't think people are aware of how well Ryzen is apparently doing in Japan. I've been asking around people that follow the MMA business in Japan, and they are doing remarkably well, even though they got taken off Fuji TV last year, which was thought to be the death knell for Ryzen. Mm-hmm. It ended up being the luckiest thing that happened to them, right? Why? Because Ryzen found out that there's a lot of fans in Japan that will pay for the pay-per-view instead of watching on free TV. They thought no one would buy the pay-per-view. Instead, their first event, the kickboxing match last year, sold 500,000 pay-per-views at about $50 a pop in Japan. That's a huge number. And then they had a 15 million plus gate at the same time. So they're selling pay-per-views for their events and large numbers of expensive tickets compared to what other promotions besides UFC sell.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Would any of that have to do with some of these exhibition fights that we're getting to see from, Floyd Mayweather? Would that have anything at all to do with it?
I think it plays a big part because that's the spectacle that fans in MMA in Japan like. And it brings a lot more attention. They do not have a massive division, and they don't have the number one fighters like they used to with Pride, or even with Dream, when Dream had some of the top lightweights and fighters still. They don't have that. What they do is they can bring in a Mayweather. They're going to bring in Pacquiao. Who knows if Nate Diaz is really going to fight there or not? But they can bring these fighters in for one fight. They don't make like UFC type money, but they make more on a single event than any other MMA promotion right now. Yeah. And so I put it with Bellator too, because they don't have, like I said, they don't have the roster. My understanding is, I was told Bellator, Scott Coker really helps Ryzen out because he sent his roster there. That's what made this event successful, because it gave it a gimmick. It gave it something for the Japanese fan base to be excited about.
It was an awesome event. Let me just put that out there. Both of them were. And the pageantry, it was just incredible. I loved it. I loved the whole crossover aspect. As a fan, this was what I feel like we were owed this for a long time.
I thought it was great. It sucks that it didn't play live on Showtime, but that's because it really wasn't a Bellator event.
Right.
It was a Ryzen event, and Bellator loaned their fighters to Ryzen, and in exchange, their fighters got paid, they got some money, and they got the rights to the rebroadcast later the next day. But this was a Ryzen event. And so Ryzen gets to promote themselves. Maybe in the future, Showtime will start selling the pay-per-view for Ryzen event in the UFC. I think that would be smart. But they're signed to fight, so they have to go through them for an hour. I don't know how long the deal lasts. But because of Coker's, that's why I put them together, because they do work together very symbiotically. They're very attached to one another, almost dependent on each other to use the Bellator fighters and to bring over these big name fighters from the West for Japanese fans, like, to get excited about events. And for Coker, it gives him an avenue to actually get his fighter. His fighters can get more fights and high paying fights by going to Japan. So it's a beneficial relationship for both of them. Something that I don't see maybe KSW. I would like to see KSW to join those two, because I think that's the only one that would make sense.
How did they do last year?
Bellator, well, the problem is Bellator lost their DAZN deal. So they're being financed exclusively by Showtime. So it's almost impossible to tell how they do because they don't. It's not like they have a set deal where you're forcing. Viacom owns Bellator, so they're bidding against themselves, so they can't force the price up as high as possible. So we don't know exactly how well they do. They still sell more tickets than the other American promotions, but it's nothing like the UFC. So my guess is they did decent because they got to finally go back on the international market, which they built up before, but it's nothing like it was when they finally hit it big with the DAZN deal. So I'm guessing we're almost back to the days before that where they might be losing us, either breaking even or losing a little bit of money.
What about the rumors that Bellator is for sale? Because Ariel Helwani was the one that initiated that. So you kind of consider the source and think that this might be?
Well, the people have been talking about Bellator for sale for years, and it actually started when World Series of Fighting became PFL. And they were looking for a bank like investment bank, Goldman Sachs or one of them, to handle their initial investments, right? They're raising money. And what happened is the leak was with one of the banks. I can't remember what bank they went to, said we can't do it because we're handling a sale for Bellator. And so Bellator, everybody was assuming Bellator is for sale. I found out, I'm pretty clear, I found out is that Bellator was really trying to sell, DAZN was really trying to buy a chunk of Bellator at the time. And so, because we're gonna put you on our network, we want to own a chunk of the promotion to keep you here, to make sure we have some say in the matter. It fell apart. The COVID epidemic hit. The deal fell apart. They left. But the idea that Bellator, in my understanding, is Bellator's always been for sale. It's not like it's a fire sale, like Viacom's got to get rid of them. It's just that Viacom put a ton of money into them. If anybody offers them enough money, they are willing to accept it. It's almost like Top Rank with Bob Arum. He's floated the idea of anybody out there who has the right connections, wants to throw enough money at him, he is more than willing to sell Top Rank.
I mean, he's 91. I would be willing to sell too.
Yes, well, I'd be willing to sell tomorrow, whatever I got, if you offer me enough. But I think I don't think it's like there's not a fire sale or anything, but I just think it's the common, the ownership of Bellator is always on the lookout. If someone wants to offer them enough, a large enough money to make it worthwhile for them, they're willing to sell the company.
Let's talk one championship. Can we start talking about one championship for real? Because, boy, it seems like all the books are cooked.
Yeah, we reported their finances all the way up through 2021, and every year they lose a ton of money, and they do not show the best finances. They don't show anything to get excited. They show increasing revenue, but then you break it down, and you're like, well, a lot of that revenue sounds like barter revenue, and that's not really legitimate money because it's not cash. We don't know how you come up with the price for these items. So is it for real? It's still questionable. I do not see, there's nothing I see. I see good things happening for them. They signed with Amazon. They plan to come in the U.S. There seems to be getting traction and actual attention for their shows. That they're converting fans in the U.S. market because of the Amazon deal. But you look at nothing seems to be massive enough that I'd say they're really generating a lot of money. They are very dependent on that large amount of capital they raise from investors, which they're burning through a large amount. And I think they're cutting back in costs as we see it going along because they've been burning through so much. But they're dependent on that investor capital that they raised, the original equity. You can look at some of the items we have. They don't seem to sell like a ton of tickets. If they had a product that a lot of people are clamoring for, you'd think they'd sell more tickets. Merchandise, I don't hear much about merchandise sales. If you have a big fan base and a very powerful brand that they claim they're the true them and the UFC are the true monopolies in the industry. With them in the East and, UFC out here, you would think that they'd have massive merchandise sales like the UFC does, but we don't see that in their books. So I'm still very questionable. I think they do a very good job of building themselves up, but I have yet to see anything that says they are really doing the numbers that they've always claimed they've done.
How big is that Amazon deal for them? And what about holding their first event in the U.S. this year? Is that going to be the thing that actually puts them over?
I mean, I think that it will help. It'll bring more attention. It'll be interesting that they're bringing their rule set to the U.S. But like the Amazon deal is massive in the sense that you could tell the big change as soon as they started playing on Amazon, that there's a lot more attention. It seems like a lot more traffic on our website. I haven't looked at all the metrics, but doesn't it seem like the way that more people are more interested in them ever since it went on Amazon? The problem is the Amazon deal asking around, it doesn't sound like that big a money deal. Like it's my understanding, it's like $5 million a year, which is much better than what they had before. But $5 million a year is not going to, when you're losing at right now $50 million a year, let's say, that's not going to cover the losses. And the bad news for them is they're stuck with it for, I think, 4 more years. So they need a much bigger media rights deal in the U.S. to cover those losses, the expenses they're having. And I don't know if they're going to, if you're stuck in this deal, it might be great growing the fan base, but how long can you be in this deal and be burning through the money you're burning? So that's one. I guess the big news, we will wait and see what happens when they fight in the U.S. They have their U.S. event. If we see a large amount of ticket sales, we see strong ticket sales and a lot of attention, that's a very good sign, because then they can start maybe renegotiate with Amazon. They can maybe get a side deal for their other events in the U.S. They can start selling pay-per-view. They have options at that point. We can see that their brand is really taken off. But I think we're going to have to wait to see what happens with that first U.S. event.
What is their end goal? And further, are they still planning that IPO?
Well, the IPO was always the end goal, but now it doesn't seem like it, because they're talking about a SPAC for a while, but then the SEC started cracking down on these SPACs. SPACs are like these reverse mergers. So you don't have there's not as much investigation of your company before you go public. So that ended. There's talk they're going to do an IPO, and they started listing with the SEC. They moved out of Singapore into the Caymans, and they listed the company on the SEC. We keep waiting for them to submit documents, but they apparently are no longer listed on the SEC, which means that they apparently have no plans to go public in the United States. So what is the end goal? I'm not sure. My guess is they're potentially shopping around for someone Middle East country, some investors over there to buy it off them, to put a large amount of money into it. I mean, he says he's willing to keep spending money, but I can't, unless someone takes it off his hands, I can't imagine people keep putting more and more money, watering down the shares they have, and not see the return, because we're not seeing that massive turnaround that you would expect with the company that's just ready to take off. Maybe this year will be different, but I'm not seeing it. I'm not detecting it. But again, the big thing will be, well, let's see what happens with that U.S. event. But the U.S. event might be successful, but I don't think it's going to be a game changer. I think they're just going to continue burning through money. And as that money dwindles that they've raised and they can't get more investment, they're going to have to, the good news, they don't have a ton of debt, so they don't have to pay interest. They'll just have to really cut costs, and they'll start, scaling down operations.
It's a trip that they've been in business since like 2013?
Yeah, actually, they might have started earlier than that, but that's when their first events started being held. 2012 or 2013, I believe it was. Yeah.
I mean, and they're still struggling to gain a foothold at all. It's incredible. All right, let's talk about the big bad, the UFC. How did the UFC do in 2022? And what do you think their financial outlook is for 2023?
Well, the strange thing is the UFC, if you looked at like their sales, like pay-per-view sales, you think they did bad because they didn't have any big pay-per-view sales seem to be very low. At one point, they said they had no event that did over 400,000. And I got the numbers for a few events, and yeah, they were like 200,000, 300,000 lower. So the events for a long portion of the year were not going gangbusters. But you get to like later in the year, I think a few events did better than that, but nothing. There was no big blockbuster pay-per-view event. So you think that the UFC did poor. But the thing is, they have everything's so much contractual revenue now. Everything's contractual revenue with the TV rights, the pay-per-view, all their sponsorship, and they keep selling more and more sponsorship. They have the cryptocurrency, even though cryptocurrency's falling apart. I'm sure they got paid. They have their Venom deal. All their deals in sponsorship revenues through the roof. Their contractual revenue means even when the pay-per-views do bad, they're making more every year. So this year, I bet you when it comes out, this year, even though it didn't have the big blockbusters, this year will do as financially well as last year, perhaps better. And on top of that, in fact, probably better because the payouts for the fighters, I don't think went up at all because there was no big purses. There's no Conor McGregor. There's no Khabib. Israel Adesanya was probably the highest paid guy. I'm getting combined purses. He made what, 15, 18, 20 million max on his 3 fights. So their outlook for last year is still going to be good. And their outlook for next year is even better because, again, contractual revenue keeps going up.
Does the Dana White domestic violence incident hurt them? And will there be any repercussions for Mr. White?
I don't think it hurts them because I don't think people care about MMA, right? I don't think people view it as like a legit. We the fans, MMA fans, but we're a niche. We're a small group of people that like MMA. The public does not think much of it. They think of it as the executives of other companies, I think view it as a trash sport. So they don't put much thought to it. The idea that its image has been hurt doesn't impact them, right? And there's a separation between them and UFC. Like Disney doesn't care because Disney has ESPN. And then ESPN, who works with the UFC, is just going to claim, oh, we have nothing to do with UFC itself. We just distribute its broadcast. They do all the production. So they have this separation. They can claim that's just that trash sport that does this stuff. So I don't think it's really going to hurt them in the long run because I think in a few months it'll be forgotten. Though there is the opportunity to cause some problems because it does, again, tarnish the sport. The image of it is kind of this trash, violent sport. And I do think as we get into stuff like, lobbying or trying to pass bills or doing other things like that, or even rivals trying to sign fighters and the fan base, how they view these rival promotions, there might be a sense of like, well, the UFC, maybe they don't deserve to run the sport fully because there's something wrong with them, the way they act. And I'll give these other people the benefit of the doubt, or I will agree that that we need to bring in some sort of legislation that'll guide, regulate them because of their actions. But that's a slight chance. Generally, I think people just don't care. And that's sad. People don't care.
That is very, very sad. Francis Ngannou, he is now a free agent. And let me tell you, right before we started recording this, I saw a picture. And I posted it in the Slack chat for Bloody Elbow. But this picture shows Francis Ngannou with his family, and it appears that his mother is wearing a PFL shirt. And the account that posted it is called Against the Fence, and it says, "Is this a subtle hint of what's yet to come?" So that brings me to my question. What's the possibility that he and other big name fighters leave the UFC this year? Because, he's been at odds and he's been giving interviews and his manager's been giving interviews, and it doesn't look like they've come to any agreeable terms yet. So what are we looking at here?
Well, that's the PFL's plan. The whole PFL plan is they've raised specifically $30 million to sign pay-per-view fighters. They know that there's a select number of pay-per-view fighters, and they put out, Don Davis has made it very clear, we want UFC fighters to test the market and come here. That's their whole game plan, to build up that pay-per-view division. There's only a select number of fighters, Jake Paul and now Nate Diaz, who are exited the UFC. The rest of the fighters have been locked into UFC contracts. That's changed, though, because of the antitrust lawsuit. The UFC changed their contracts. So guys like Francis Ngannou, after 5 years, now gets to be a free agent. What's interesting is Francis Ngannou is a free agent. My understanding is he was a free agent sometime earlier in December. That's when he signed his contract. That's when it should have terminated. But he's made no announcements. And I'm guessing, just based on that, he's made no big announcement. My guess is he's been in negotiation with the UFC. Because, earlier in the month, it sounded like he really wanted to go back and fight like John Jones. He just wanted the UFC to agree to some of his terms. So I think that's part of it. But if the UFC is unwilling to agree to those terms, then I wouldn't be shocked if he talks to PFL and PFL offers him something because they desperately need fighters like Ngannou. And there's a whole line of fighters. We will see what happens, because if Ngannou signs with them, that opens up the door to a whole line of fighters leaving the UFC to go to PFL or go somewhere else. PFL is the one with this war chest and seemed willing probably to lose money to take risk on fighters to sign them. But, Paulo Costa is going to be up in April, right?
Yeah.
So he's a possibility. No, he's not. He's not like a headlining pay-per-view guy right now. But he's someone. If you give him the right opponent, you get him, and then maybe another middleweight comes later. But Stipe Miocic, my understanding is possibly he hasn't signed his last time. He's still on the same contract from 5 years ago. So that's up this spring apparently. Not 100% certain, but that's what it sounds like. And eventually, I mean, John Jones is apparently still on the same contract that would be up next year. So it opens the possibility if you can get one guy like Ngannou and they can start selling pay-per-views, then another heavyweight that's got his contract coming up and go, oh, God, I can go there and they're going to give us, we know, 50%. And you have a big fight like that. Those two could probably negotiate higher like boxers do. But that's a possibility. So it will be interesting because this is the first time that we've ever seen the possibility that these type of fighters can actually leave the UFC and sign somewhere else to fight. And will that happen? Will the UFC answer it by offering more money? That's the question. Because if the UFC can easily beat any offer, but will they beat any offer? That's the question.
We sort of saw the beginning of this with Affliction when they were signing a lot of names. I mean, they had Andrei Arlovsky in his prime, Fedor in his prime, Big Ben Rothwell. That was when he was very prime. Even though Arlovsky beat him, still, it was a time when Ben Rothwell was young and still winning and so on and so forth. But the difference is that PFL they established themselves before they started the pay-per-views. And of course, Affliction, all they were was pay-per-views. So
yes. Yeah. I mean, the PFL, not to interrupt you, sorry, but the PFL did some Affliction didn't do. They didn't build the TV platform. If you ever listen to old interviews with Joe Silva, he talked about that,
right? That you have to have a TV presence to sell your pay-per-views. Exactly. And so I feel like Affliction tried and they were their mind was in the right place, but they could not execute. And PFL, they were smart. They established everything first 3 years in before their first pay-per-view. Yes, is it a dud? Sure, but they did it the right way.
Well, first of all, the 3 years in, their pay-per-view plan was for all of last year to be running pay-per-views. Right. The reason they couldn't is because the fighters weren't available. They're now becoming available. Mm-hmm. Ngannou is becoming, Diaz is now available. Jake Paul is now willing to become an MMA. So the fighters are now available. And the other thing is, again, even though that pay-per-view is a bomb, I want to bring up again, for PFL, even though they lost probably millions on that, it's not the total loss that you would imagine to be because the fighter purses were not outrageous compared to like Affliction was, right? I mean, yeah, sure, they had all their champions appeared on it, but they had to pay those guys as contractual money anyways. The end of the tournament had to get that money, right? Mm-hmm. But with that event, they get the data, they get to work out the kinks. So that when they actually put on a big pay-per-view, they don't run into the problems because they were able to run through they were able to do a dry rehearsal with that pay-per-view. And they get to test out like ESPN. How good is ESPN at promoting their events by sending people, prompts and promos and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff that failed. We could call it a bad pay-per-view. Probably helped them without wasting a big fight that should, they could have put on a big fight as their first pay-per-view and run into problems that fans weren't aware of it and it bombed. And then it was like, we wasted something that could have been successful. That pay-per-view last year was not going to be successful no matter what. So it probably was the one to do as your first one, to waste, to do all your testing on that.
Yeah, that is basically what I was getting to is even though they had plans for all of last year, it doesn't matter. They established themselves for a couple of years before. They had a TV deal. They ran several tournaments. So they were pretty well firmly entrenched in this community enough where that there was a little bit of buzz around the pay-per-view and they have an established viewership, even if it's not enormous, it's established enough where that they keep getting investors and they keep trucking along. And now they have an ESPN broadcast partnership. So I feel like they did what Affliction could not.
Yeah, we should say one thing too is like even though they have a presence, I think that this does show though like the brand. All these other promotions are trying to build their brand like the UFC did. and the brand really means nothing. They did a smart thing of getting a foothold on ESPN and having a footprint, but truthfully, it is the big name fighters are the only thing that's going to draw attention to your product.
For sure.
Everybody's like, oh, we can be the next UFC and pay fighters crap, and people will buy our product and watch our shows because our logo is cool. We got a smart cage. None of that matters.
Yeah.
What matters is you got the fighters.
Exactly.
And so it'll be the fighters are now a few of them, not all, but a few of the big draws are now available, and that'll be very intriguing to see what happens next year.
What should we expect from the antitrust lawsuit this year?
Well, we should expect something. It's finally something. We very much expect that Judge Bowler will finally put out his written opinion on the class certification. He said he had ready 2 years ago. So we've been waiting 2 years from that, but because of the UFC citing this other court we call the tuna case, Oleon case, about a grocery chain and tuna and, about how class cert works. And we had to wait for the appeals process that we're now basically we just waited 2 years, waited for this case that went back to square, that the courts threw out that said that doesn't change anything. So we're back to square one. We're going to get a written opinion on the class cert. Everybody expects any day now, literally any day after the holidays, everybody expects it to come out. After that, we have an appeal. And two things could happen. Either the Ninth Circuit picks up the appeal or they turn it down. If they turn down the appeal, this case this should start moving a lot faster than what it has. If they pick up the appeal, we could have a couple years of the appeal process. But Paul Gift is confident that it's going to be picked up in appeal. I'm not so confident, speaking to people. I think there's a good chance that based on, I guess we have to see the class cert ruling, his written opinion, but I just think there's a good chance that the Ninth Circuit decides not to. And which means that the UFC would have to wait to after a trial to actually appeal the case. But they're not going to, I don't know if they're going to want to risk a trial because the potential losses are so vast. But it will be, we will see some progress this year. That's my prediction, that by the end of next year, we should be looking at either going into the appeal process or, oh my God, they're going to announce a trial coming in 2024.
What can happen in Washington, D.C. to impact the entire industry?
Okay, well, this is interesting because there's a couple things that came out of the news at the end, one out of the end of last year, which is that Nate Quarry said that Mark Wayne Mullen is planning to reintroduce the Ali Act. I'm going to wait and see that happens before I get excited because I'm not sure. Last year I heard he was going to do it and it didn't happen. Hasn't
he been sort of flaky about this?
Lately, yes, but before, he submitted it twice. They got a bunch of people signed on as co-sponsors, but now he says he's going to reintroduce it on the Senate side. The problem is, it's still, even if you get in the Senate and you get a lot of co-sponsors, a lot of interest, it still takes a lot to get a bill passed. But it's possible that that the interest is there. And again, this is where I think the PR from what Dana White could hurt him, because if it brings enough attention to him, something like that, you introduce the Ali Act, you could get potentially enough Congress people saying, oh, maybe I should pass this because these guys are Neanderthals in the UFC. And so there's that potential. That's where I think one of the risks, the PR risk to the UFC for Dana White. But I still don't think most people in the Senate do not have any interest about MMA. They're not going to be concerned. They have other priorities. So it's going to be very hard to pass. You got to remember, when the first legislation that was introduced in Congress to tackle boxing was introduced in 1960, we didn't get the Professional Boxing Safety Act until 1996. We didn't get the Ali Act to 2000 for the economic protections. So it took decades for that to happen. And so we are still, relatively recent with legislation introduced for MMA. And so it's possible, but I'm going to wait and see. All for those guys, I'm holding out hope for them, but I'm going to wait to see if there's how much momentum there really is for it.
All right. Last question. Could the FTC new rules on non-competes affect contracts for MMA fighters?
This one I do think actually might have an impact on MMA fighters, because after it was issued, it talked specifically about independent contractors were covered by it. But, I was thinking, I doubt it's going to affect, because we have this in California that, and non-competes are not allowed, but doesn't really impact fighters at all. It's never brought up. But look, if you look at the way it's written, it talks about all these types of way non-competes, what we can interpret as non-compete. So I started asking actual, experts in labor and these type of rulings, and I started digging into it. And I said, well, could this affect MMA? And if you read the antitrust lawsuit, all the extensions, all the tolling provisions are viewed as non-competes by the attorneys in that case, which is interesting. But the way it's written is that it's the items that would prevent you from going on after your contract's done, right? That seems to be the priority. Is they want when your contract is up, you need to be able to leave to get the most money. And so there's two items. One, I think, is definitely would very likely be affected by this. It seems very, very likely that would fall under the new ruling. One is a very strong possibility. The strong possibility is the matching period might fall under this because your contract's up, and what the matching period is basically deny you the opportunity to go somewhere else and deny the chance for competition to build to then can offer other people more money. So it affects competition. That is a possibility that the FTC, that this ruling, if it survives legal challenges, would impact them. But the one that I think really falls in it is the champion clause, because the whole point of the champion clause is to prevent the champion from going anywhere to earn more money.
Oof.
And so I think it's very possible if the rule is going to go into effect, they're going to have people write in their comments. They're going to have a hearing about it, but they've already announced that this will be the rule this is going to be the FTC's rules. Maybe some slight changes, and then it's going to probably be challenged in court. But by the end of the year, maybe even before sometime this year, these rules will probably go into effect. And if that's the case, unless they don't survive legal challenge, but if they do go into effect, then I think the championship clause would fall under it.
You think the UFC is looking at all this?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure they're paying attention. But not just UFC. The other promotions use the champion clause, too.
Yeah, but I think the UFC, it would impact the most, though.
Well, yeah, the UFC fighters are the most valuable, so it's probably the biggest impact on the industry. But a lot of the other promotions depend on the championship clause more because they do not want to compete with other promotions.
Right.
And so they want to tie you up and say, okay, we're going to use the championship clause because we don't want to offer you more money. And so I think on all fronts, that's a positive. I hope it passes because it's not even for fighters, but for just in general, that the non-competes are absurd that we've allowed in this country. So this is great and great for fighters, great for regular workers. I'm looking forward to this actually going into effect.
Well, all right. So that's going to bring us to the end of the episode. But John, you already have an idea of what our next episode will be in a few weeks out. You want to give them a little teaser?
The next episode should be us looking at the finances of the PFL and going through their 2021 investor presentation of what they told investors to plan on, and then looking at some other stuff to see where they stand today and what to expect them going forward, what their current finances are.
Awesome. I am looking forward to that. So on that note, do me a favor. Follow this guy on social media. He's only on Twitter, but he is active. He replies. He's at Hey Not the Face. And if you have questions, suggestions about topics you want to hear, please at him. Remember, Hey Not the Face, or myself, Crooklyn MMA. You can email him as well, heynottheface@gmail.com. And you can email me, that's crooklyn949@gmail.com. So, until next time, please stay safe.
It's not in the face! Thank you.